I used to think love was supposed to feel obvious. Not easy exactly, just recognizable. Like you would know when someone cared about you because your body would stop bracing all the time. But lately, I think most of my relationships have felt more like interpretations. Little clues, tiny reassurances, carefully worded messages, long pauses I pretend not to notice. I remember one night sitting in my car outside my apartment building after seeing him. The engine was already off, the parking lot was mostly empty, and I stayed there longer than I needed to because I kept reading his last message. Text me when you get upstairs. It should have felt sweet, and maybe it was, but I remember staring at it and trying to measure something impossible. Was this warmth, habit, politeness, or love? I hated that my mind worked like that. I hated that every interaction felt like something I had to study instead of simply receive. Upstairs, I carried my groceries into the kitchen and stood there for a while without turning on the light. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator humming. I sent the message, I'm home. Then I placed my phone face down on the counter like I was trying not to expect anything from it. Well, I still checked while washing my hands and nothing. And the embarrassing thing is, I don't even think I was waiting for a conversation. I just wanted something small, a heart, a good night, a tiny confirmation that I still existed warmly in someone else's mind after leaving the room. That's the part I never really admitted out loud. How exhausting it is to quietly need reassurance while also trying very hard to appear emotionally low maintenance. Especially now. Everyone wants closeness, but nobody wants to seem like they need it too much. So we've all become careful with our timing, careful with our feelings, careful with double text, careful with tone. Sometimes I think modern love is just people trying to feel close to each other without ever fully relaxing. And after a while, you stop noticing how tense you've become. It just starts feeling normal. He wasn't cruel. I think that's important. If he had been obviously cold or dismissive, maybe things would have felt simpler. But he was thoughtful in quiet ways. He remembered small details. He sent me songs sometimes. He called when he could. He always sounded genuinely happy to hear my voice. And somehow that almost made it harder because nothing was bad enough to name. Still, I noticed myself adjusting constantly. I learned how to phrase things softly, how to bring up disappointment without sounding disappointed, how to ask for reassurance in ways that sounded casual enough not to scare anybody. I became very good at pretending I was okay with things before I even knew whether I actually was. If it took longer to reply than usual, I told myself he was tired. If he sounded distracted on the phone, I became gentler. If plans changed, I said it's fine so quickly it almost sounded rehearsed. And maybe it was. I think some people learn early that love stays safer when you make yourself easier to carry. So I did, without even realizing how automatic it had become. One evening, I was making tea while waiting for him to call. The kettle clicked softly, rain tapped against the kitchen window. And I remember checking my phone every few minutes, even though there were no notifications. Eventually, he called almost an hour later. He apologized, as usual, said work had been hectic, said his head was all over the place, and immediately my disappointment disappeared beneath concern. I asked about his day, asked if he had eaten, asked whether he was sleeping properly. By the end of the conversation, he sounded calmer, lighter. Yeah. After we hung up, I realized something quite uncomfortable. I knew how he was feeling almost all the time. But he rarely knew how I was feeling, unless I packaged it carefully enough to fit around whatever he was already carrying. And somehow, even then, I still felt guilty for needing space inside the relationship. There's a specific kind of loneliness that happens when somebody loves a version of you that never asks for too much. Not because they are manipulative. Sometimes they just get used to your softness, your flexibility, your emotional competence. You become the calm one, the understanding one, the emotionally organized one. And after a while, people stop checking whether being that person is exhausting for you. I don't think he noticed how often I anticipated his moods. I could tell from the way he typed, from how long his pauses were, from whether he used punctuations. Some nights I would stare at my screen before replying, trying to choose a version of myself that felt easiest to receive. Warm enough, not too emotional, and not distant either. There was always this invisible balancing act. And maybe he was doing his own version of it too, I don't know. That's part of what makes modern love feel so strange. Everyone is carrying private exhaustion while trying not to become emotionally inconvenient. One weekend, we spent almost the entire day together. We went grocery shopping, walked slowly through crowded aisles, argued softly over what snacks to buy, shared a bottle of juice while waiting in line. From the outside, it probably looked peaceful, and parts of it were. And I remember standing beside him while he scrolled through his phone near the freezer section. I was talking, not about anything important, just something small that happened during my week. And halfway through my sentence, I realized he wasn't listening anymore. Not intentionally. His attention had simply drifted somewhere else. I stopped talking, and he didn't notice immediately. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it was dramatic, but because I started realizing how often I disappeared quietly in the middle of ordinary moments, and how often I helped people stay emotionally comfortable while quietly becoming lonelier myself. I started feeling tired in strange ways. Not physical tiredness exactly, more like emotional over awareness. Like my brain was constantly scanning the relationship for temperature changes. If it became quieter than usual, I noticed. If it sounded distracted, I noticed. If affection felt slightly reduced, I noticed immediately. And then I would begin adjusting myself before he even asked. I gave more space, more understanding, more patience. Sometimes I think I confuse emotional attentiveness with love. I thought being deeply tuned into someone meant the relationship was intimate. But eventually, it started feeling more like maintenance. Like I was emotionally buffering every difficult silence before it could fully land between us. There was one night I remember very clearly. I had a very difficult day. It was not like catastrophic. It was just one of those quiet accumulations, but it was very difficult. Work felt heavy. I was behind on laundry. I had barely eaten. And all day I kept thinking of hearing his voice later. Not even for solutions, just comfort. And when he finally called, he spent almost 40 minutes talking about his own stress. I listened, obviously, asked questions, reassured him, made little comforting sounds at the right moment. And somewhere during the conversation, I realized I was slowly becoming absent from my own evening. By the time we hung up, he sounded better. I felt emptier. I sat on my bed afterwards, staring at the pile of folded clothes beside me. My room was dim except for the lights from my phone. And I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could care about you sincerely while still really noticing the emotional shape you've been folding yourself into for them. The loneliness became harder to ignore after that. It was not dramatic loneliness, just this quiet feeling of constantly being emotionally nearby without feeling arriving somewhere. We still talked, still laughed, still shared pieces of our days. Nothing had technically broken, but love started feeling strangely administrative. Checking in, responding, managing tone, timing vulnerability, monitoring distance. I spent so much time trying to maintain emotional closeness that I stopped noticing whether I actually felt emotionally held. One night, I sent him a voice note. It was nothing heavy, just me talking softly about my day while washing dishes. Water running in the background, plates touching lightly. Guess what? He reacted to it hours later with a heart, a heart, an ordinary emoji. That was all. And for some reason, I cried. Not immediately. I just stood there holding the dish towel in my hand while something inside me quietly collapsed from exhaustion. Because I realized how long I had been surviving on fragments, tiny reassurances, half attention, brief warmth squeezed between distractions. And I kept telling myself it was enough because technically something was still there. But emotionally, I felt lonelier besides that almost love that I had during some of my years alone. That realization frightened me, not because it meant he didn't care, but because I wasn't sure I knew how to stop adapting myself around emotional inconsistency. I had become so good at making relationship emotionally manageable that I barely noticed when they stopped nourishing me. The realization came quietly. Of course it did. Not during an argument, not during some dramatic ending. It happened while I was folding clothes. A very ordinary Tuesday night. The television was on low volume in the background, the room smelled faintly like detergent, and my phone was beside me on the bed. Unread message. I had already seen the preview. Sorry, full stop. Busy day, full stop. Nothing. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, and suddenly I noticed that my chest felt strangely heavy. I wasn't even disappointed anymore. I was prepared. Prepared for delayed affection, prepared for emotional partialness, prepared for to understand, prepared to minimize my own needs before they fully formed. And I think that scared me more than heartbreak would have. Because somewhere along the way, love had stopped feeling like connection. It started feeling like emotional management. Like I was constantly adjusting my expectations to protect the relationship from the full weight of my honesty. I sat there holding one of my sweaters in my lap and realized how emotionally absent I had become from my own life. Everything revolved around emotional calibration. How to say things, how when to say them, whether to even say them at all. I had become so focused on being understandable that I stopped asking whether I felt understood. And maybe that was part of why modern love feels so complicated. Not because people don't care, but because so many of us are terrified of becoming difficult to hold. So we perform softness until we disappear inside it. After that, nothing changed outwardly, at least not immediately. We still spoke, still sent each other small updates, still asked about each other's days. But internally, something became quieter. I stopped rushing, stopped writing messages 3 times before sending them, stopped over explaining my moods, stopped trying to emotionally smooth every silence. At first, it felt unnatural, like I was neglecting something important. But eventually, I realized how much energy I had spent trying to prevent distance before it even happened. I had been carrying emotional responsibility that belongs to both of us. One evening, he took hours to reply. Normally, I would have checked my phone constantly, built stories in my head, measured tone, prepared myself emotionally before seeing the message. Instead, I made dinner, watched a quiet show, folded towels, and went to bed. When his message finally came through, I read it calmly. And the strange thing was, guess what? The world didn't collapse. I mean, the silence existed and I survived it. I think that was the beginning. Not detachment exactly, just less self abandonment. I became more observant after that. Not hyper vigilant, just honest. I noticed how often I apologized before expressing feelings, how quickly I softened disappointment, how instinctively I made myself emotionally convenient. I noticed how often I translated other people's behavior into kinder explanations while ignoring my own hurt. I started allowing small misunderstandings to remain unresolved. That felt huge for me. Yeah, because before I would rush to clarify everything. If someone seems distant, I explained myself. If tension appeared, I fixed it. If emotional uncertainty entered the room, I worked immediately to remove it. But now, sometimes I simply sat with it. Not coldly, not to punish anyone. I was just tired of bleeding emotional energy into every silence. One night, he asked if something was wrong. I stared at the message for a while because for once I didn't know how to explain the exhaustion without sounding unfair. Nothing terrible had happened per se. That was the complicated part. I simply saw that love had become a place where I performed emotional resilience more often than emotional honesty. Eventually, I replied, just tired lately. And maybe that was the most truthful thing I had said in months. The relief came softly, not all at once, more like my nervous system slowly realizing it no longer had to monitor everything constantly. I started leaving messages unanswered for a little while without panicking. I stopped interpreting every pause as danger. I stopped trying to earn reassurance indirectly. And quietly, I began returning to myself. I started noticing small things again. Morning lights on my kitchen floor, the comfort of making tea slowly, music while cleaning, walking home without checking my phone every few minutes. It felt strange how much emotional space opened up once I stopped centering someone else's emotional availability around my sense of stability. The relationship didn't explode, no, and there was no dramatic ending either. If anything, things probably looked mostly the same from the outside. But internally, I was no longer stretching myself constantly to preserve cold closeness. I think that's what changed. I stopped believing love required continuous emotional self editing. Sometimes I still miss him, or maybe not him exactly. Maybe I miss the hopefulness that existed at the beginning, the softness, the possibility. But I don't miss the version of myself that lived in constant emotional anticipation. The girl who stared at her phone trying to measure affection through response times. The girl who translated silence into patience. The girl who kept shrinking her needs into emotional acceptable sizes. These days, my apartment feels quieter, not lonely, just calm. Calmer. I leave dishes in the sink sometimes. I fall asleep without rereading conversations. I let messages wait until morning. And every now and then, I still catch myself reaching for old habits, wanting to explain too much, wanting to soften myself immediately, wanting to earn emotional certainty. But now I notice it, and noticing feels different than disappearing. I think modern love becomes complicated when people start fearing the weight of their own humanity. So we become careful, digestible, emotionally efficient. And somewhere inside all that carefulness, we lose the simple feeling of being met naturally. I don't think I have answers yet, only quieter boundaries, softer expectations, a little more honesty with myself. Tonight, the windows are open. The city sounds feel distant. My phone is somewhere across the room, and for the first time in a long time, I'm not waiting beside it for proof that I matter. I am just here, breathing, and strangely, that feels closer to peace than anything else has in a while. Whew. Okay. Hello, guys. If you have made it to the end of the video, I really appreciate, and I hope you picked something that could help you or someone close to you, or maybe you have an experience to share. I would really appreciate if you drop it in the comments. But before then, please like, comment, subscribe, share, and turn on your notification bell so that whenever we drop a new video, you are going to be the first person to get it. Yeah. So please kindly drop in the comments your own personal experiences, or maybe if you want me to tell your story, you can always drop it in the comments and I will reach out to you. Or yeah, give our probably yeah, I'll reach out to you or send or drop a way for you to contact me directly. I am so happy that you stayed to this moment, and I really appreciate. And enough of my rambling, and bye, I guess.